What would you do if the inheritance your family mocked as worthless turned out to conceal a secret so valuable that it would not only restore your fortune, but rewrite the history of your entire region and force those who scorned you to confront the truth of their own greed? For 19-year-old Beatrice Hartwell, this was no idle question. In the autumn of 1871, in the drawing room of Hartwell Hall in the Suffolk marshlands, she stood before her assembled family as her grandfather's will was read aloud, a will that divided his modest estate among his 4 grandchildren with what seemed like cruel randomness. To her eldest cousin Edmund went the profitable grain mill and its steady income. To her second cousin Lavinia went the comfortable townhouse in Ipswich and its rents. To her younger cousin George went the coastal farmland with its valuable access to the sea. And to Beatrice, the family's only orphan, tolerated but never truly embraced, went a derelict stone windmill on the farthest edge of the marshes, a crumbling ruin that hadn't turned a sail in 30 years, valued in the solicitor's papers at precisely £2.10. The laughter that erupted from her cousins was immediate and cruel. But what none of them knew, what even Beatrice herself could not have imagined, was that beneath that forgotten windmill lay a network of chambers that had been sealed for a century, containing a discovery that would make scholars travel from across Europe and transform the worthless marsh into the most historically significant site in East Anglia. Settle in and let us travel back to the Suffolk coast of 1871, to a story of patient investigation, hidden history, and the vindication of a girl who refused to believe that her worth could be measured in pounds and shillings. The morning of the will reading, Beatrice had woken before dawn in her small room in the servants' wing of Hartwell Hall, the room she had occupied since she was 7 years old, when both her parents had drowned in a boating accident and she had been taken in by her grandfather out of duty rather than affection. She dressed in her mourning black, the same dress she had worn to her grandfather's funeral 3 days prior, carefully mended at the cuffs where the fabric had begun to fray. She had loved her grandfather in the careful, reserved way one loves someone who is kind but distant. He had ensured she was fed, clothed, and educated, but always separately from her cousins, always reminded that she was there on sufferance. The education, at least, had been thorough. Grandfather Hartwell had believed that all children, regardless of gender, should be able to read, write, calculate, and think. He had given her access to his library, and in those books, Beatrice had found a refuge from the casual cruelties of her cousins. Now, standing in the drawing room, with the September light slanting through the tall windows, she kept her face composed as the family solicitor, Mr. Wickham, read through the bequests in his dry, precise voice. Edmund smirked when his inheritance was announced. The grain mill brought in £300 a year, a comfortable income. Lavinia actually clapped her hands when she heard about the townhouse. She had always wanted to live in the city, away from what she called this dreary marsh. George whooped with delight at the farmland. He fancied himself a gentleman farmer and had already been making plans. And then Mr. Wickham cleared his throat and read, "To my granddaughter, Beatrice Mary Hartwell, I leave the property known as Marsh Windmill, including the structure and all land within a quarter-mile radius, together with all contents, fixtures, and such items as may be discovered therein." There was a moment of silence. Then Edmund laughed, a sharp, barking sound that held no warmth. The old ruin on the marsh, that pile of stones, Good Lord, grandfather must have been having a joke. Lavinia covered her mouth with her hand, but her eyes danced with malicious amusement. Oh, Beatrice, you poor thing. What will you possibly do with a broken windmill? Sleep in it? George snorted. It's barely worth the cost of demolishing it. The land's worthless, nothing but salt marsh and seabirds. Can't even graze sheep on it. Beatrice stood very still, her hands clasped in front of her, and said nothing. She had learned long ago that responding to their mockery only encouraged it. Edmund turned to Mr. Wickham. Surely there's been some mistake. Grandfather couldn't have meant to leave her something so utterly valueless, while the rest of us receive actual property. Mr. Wickham's expression was carefully neutral. There is no mistake, Mr. Hartwell. The will is quite clear. Each bequest was made with great deliberation by your grandfather over the course of several months before his death. Well, Lavinia said, rising gracefully and smoothing her skirts, I suppose we should be grateful he at least got her out of the house. No offense, Beatrice, but you can hardly expect to continue living here now that the property is being divided. The windmill will have to serve as your lodging. It was said sweetly, with a smile, which made it all the more cruel. Beatrice met her cousin's eyes steadily. None taken, Lavinia. I'm sure the windmill will suit me perfectly. Edmund laughed again. Suit you? It doesn't even have a roof. The sails fell off years ago, and I'd wager the entire structure is one good storm away from collapse. Then I shall have to inspect it carefully, Beatrice replied calmly. Mr. Wickham, when might I take possession? The solicitor looked at her with what might have been respect. Immediately, Miss Hartwell. I have the deed here, and the key. He handed her a heavy iron key, old and ornate, its surface dark with age. Beatrice took it, feeling its weight in her palm. There is one more thing, Mr. Wickham added, reaching into his document case. Your grandfather left this letter to be given to you privately after the reading. He handed her a sealed envelope with her name written in her grandfather's careful copperplate hand. Edmund rolled his eyes. How touching. Perhaps he's written instructions on how to keep the rain out. The cousins departed, still laughing among themselves, already making plans to survey their new properties. Beatrice remained behind with Mr. Wickham. Miss Hartwell, the solicitor said quietly, your grandfather was a man of singular judgment. I have served this family for 30 years, and I never knew him to act capriciously. Are you suggesting there's more to the windmill than appears? Beatrice asked. I am suggesting, Mr. Wickham replied carefully, that you read his letter and you inspect your inheritance thoroughly before you make any decisions about its value. After he left, Beatrice sat alone in the drawing room and opened the envelope. Her grandfather's letter was brief. My dear Beatrice, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are no doubt wondering why I have left you what appears to be the least valuable portion of my estate. I did so because you are the only one of my grandchildren who has shown true curiosity, true patience, and true intelligence. Your cousins see only the surface value of things. You, I have observed, look deeper. The Marsh Windmill holds a secret I have kept for 50 years, a secret I discovered by accident as a young man and chose to protect rather than exploit. I never had the courage or perhaps the vision to bring it to light. I believe you do. Inspect the structure carefully. Look beyond what is obvious, and remember, what the world dismisses as worthless often holds the greatest treasures. Trust your mind, Beatrice. It is sharper than you know. Your loving grandfather, Thomas Hartwell. Beatrice read the letter 3 times, her heart beating faster with each reading. A secret, hidden for 50 years. She folded the letter carefully, placed it in her pocket, and stood. She had an inheritance to inspect. The journey to the marsh windmill was a testament to its isolation. Beatrice walked the 3 miles from Hartwell Hall, her few possessions tied in a bundle over her shoulder, following the narrow track that wound through the salt marshes. The landscape was austere and beautiful in its way. Vast expanses of waving marsh grass, interrupted by channels of dark water that glinted in the autumn sun, and overhead, the endless cry of curlews and gulls. The air smelled of salt and mud, and the sharp, clean scent of the sea beyond. As she walked, she passed no other habitation. This was the loneliest corner of her grandfather's land, too wet for farming, too remote for building. And then, rising from the marsh like a broken tooth, she saw it, the marsh windmill. It was larger than she had expected, a stone tower, perhaps 40 feet high, built of the local grey stone and weathered to the colour of storm clouds. 2 of its 4 sails still clung to the cap, askew and skeletal, like the wings of some vast wounded bird. The other 2 had fallen and lay in the marsh grass, their wooden frames half consumed by rot and weather. The door hung open on one hinge. The windows, narrow arches slits, for this had once been a fortified structure, were dark and empty. Edmund had been right about one thing. It looked one strong wind away from collapse. But as Beatrice drew closer, she noticed something that gave her pause. The stonework, though weathered, was extraordinarily well made. The blocks were precisely cut and fitted, the mortar still intact in most places. This was not a structure built to fail. This was a structure built to endure. She pushed the door fully open and stepped inside. The interior was a single round chamber, perhaps 20 feet in diameter. Light streamed through the gaps in the floor above, illuminating a space that was empty, save for the massive central post that had once supported the millstones and the turning mechanism. The wooden gears and machinery had long since been removed or rotted away. Dust covered everything. Bird droppings spattered the floor. A family of mice skittered away as she entered. It was, objectively, a ruin. But Beatrice stood in the center and turned slowly, looking not at what was there, but at what might be hidden. Look beyond what is obvious, her grandfather had written. She examined the walls, running her hands over the stone, looking for irregularities. She inspected the floor, stamping carefully to test for hollow spaces. She peered up at the ceiling, at the rickety wooden stairs that led to the upper levels. Nothing immediately revealed itself. As the afternoon light began to fade, Beatrice made a decision. She would spend the night here, not because she had anywhere else to go, though that was certainly true, but because she needed time, uninterrupted time, to search. She had brought candles, matches, a blanket, and some bread and cheese. It would suffice. As darkness fell, and the marsh came alive with the sounds of night birds and the distant rush of the tide, Beatrice lit her candles and began a systematic search. She started at the top, climbing the precarious stairs to the cap level where the sail mechanisms had once been housed. The space was small, open to the sky, in places where the roof had failed. Nothing here but birds' nests, and the rusted remains of iron fittings. The second level was similar, an empty circular room, its floorboards sagging dangerously. She tested each board before putting her weight on it, working her way around the perimeter. It was here, pressed against the outer wall, that she found the first anomaly. A section of the wooden floor, about 3 feet square, was made of different boards than the rest. They were newer, not new, but perhaps 50 years old, rather than 100. They had been carefully fitted, but to a trained eye, the difference was visible. Beatrice knelt and examined the edges. No nails. The boards were simply laid in place. Her heart racing, she worked her fingers under the edge and lifted. The section came up easily, revealing a dark space below. She held her candle over the opening. It was not a void. It was a shaft, a narrow, vertical shaft descending into darkness, with iron rungs set into the stone wall. A ladder leading down. Beatrice sat back on her heels, her mind racing. This was it. This was what her grandfather had meant. But leading where? There was only one way to find out. She tested the first rung carefully. It held. Taking a deep breath, holding her candle in one hand, Beatrice began to descend into the hidden shaft. The climb down was terrifying. The rungs were solid but slippery with condensation, and the candle flame flickered wildly, threatening to go out and leave her in absolute darkness. She counted as she went. 10 rungs, 15, 20. She was descending below the ground level of the windmill, into the earth itself. At 30 rungs, her foot touched solid stone. She had reached the bottom. Beatrice stepped off the ladder and held her candle high. The flame steadied, and she gasped. She was standing in a chamber, not a natural cave, but a man-made room, carved from the bedrock, perhaps 15 feet on each side, with a vaulted stone ceiling. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves, books. Hundreds of books. And not just books. Manuscripts, scrolls, wooden boxes, ceramic jars, all carefully arranged and remarkably well preserved in the cool, dry air. Beatrice moved forward, almost in a trance, and picked up the nearest volume. It was bound in leather, the cover embossed with symbols she didn't recognize. She opened it carefully. The pages were vellum, covered in dense handwriting, in what appeared to be medieval Latin, accompanied by intricate illustrations in faded but still vivid inks, botanical drawings, astronomical charts, geometric diagrams. Her hands trembling, she set it down and picked up another. This one was in Old English, the language of Chaucer, detailing what appeared to be medical treatments using herbs and minerals. Another was in French, another in a language she couldn't identify at all. She turned to the wooden boxes and opened one. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were more manuscripts, these even older, on parchment so delicate it seemed to whisper as she touched it. On the far wall, she noticed something else, a heavy iron-bound chest, secured with a lock. But beside it, carved into the stone wall itself, was an inscription in Latin. Beatrice's education served her well. She translated slowly. Here lies the wisdom preserved through darkness, kept safe from those who would destroy knowledge in the name of faith. Let those who find this place be worthy guardians. She stood in the center of the chamber, turning slowly, and the magnitude of what she had discovered began to sink in. This was not just a collection of old books. This was a hidden library, a cache of knowledge that had been deliberately concealed and preserved. But why? And by whom? She noticed a smaller book on a pedestal near the entrance, set apart from the others. It was newer, the leather cover dated 1821. She opened it. The handwriting inside was her grandfather's, but younger, more vigorous. It was a journal. Beatrice sat on the stone floor and began to read. 15th August, 1821. Today I have made the most extraordinary discovery of my life, and I fear I am quite paralyzed by the weight of it. I was inspecting the old windmill, which I inherited from father last year, and which has not operated in decades, with a mind to either restore it or demolish it. While examining the upper levels, I noticed an irregularity in the flooring, and upon investigation, discovered a concealed entrance to a shaft leading down into the earth. Curiosity overcame caution, and I descended. What I found below defies belief, a hidden chamber containing what appears to be a monastic library dating from before the dissolution. I am no scholar, but even I can recognize the significance of these manuscripts. There are works here in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, even Arabic, and what I believe may be early Saxon. Medical texts, astronomical treatises, philosophical works, histories, illuminated manuscripts of extraordinary beauty. And I believe, though I can scarcely credit it, that this collection was hidden here during King Henry VI's dissolution of the monasteries, when monastic libraries across England were destroyed or scattered. Some brave soul or souls must have saved what they could and concealed it here, in this remote place, intending perhaps to return when it was safe. They never did. And so this knowledge has waited, hidden, and protected for 300 years. Beatrice turned the pages, her heart pounding. Her grandfather's journal continued over several weeks, documenting his exploration of the collection. He had consulted discreetly with scholars, without revealing the source, and confirmed his suspicion. Many of these manuscripts were believed lost. Some were unique, the only surviving copies of works known only by reputation. The collection was priceless, both monetarily and historically. And then his tone changed. 22nd September, 1821. I have made a decision that I know some would call foolish. I will not reveal this discovery to the world. Not yet, perhaps not in my lifetime. My reason is this. I have seen what happens when valuable discoveries are made. They are seized upon by those with power and wealth. They are exploited, sold piecemeal to private collectors, locked away in the libraries of the rich, where they serve only as trophies. This knowledge was hidden by those who valued it more than their own safety. It deserves better than to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. I will keep this secret. I will preserve it, and when I die, I will leave it to the one grandchild I believe will have the wisdom to bring it to light properly, with respect, with scholarship, with the intention that it should benefit all, not simply enrich the few. I do not yet know who that will be. My grandchildren are still young. But I will watch them as they grow, and I will know. The journal ended there. Beatrice closed it carefully, tears streaming down her face. Her grandfather had been watching her all those years. He had seen her curiosity, her love of learning, her integrity, and he had trusted her with this. The next 3 days, Beatrice did not leave the windmill. She descended into the chamber each morning and worked until the light failed, carefully examining the collection, making lists, handling each manuscript with reverent care. She found medical texts from the great Arab physicians, translated into Latin by medieval scholars. She found astronomical observations from centuries before Galileo. She found histories of Saxon England, philosophical treatises, illuminated prayer books of breathtaking beauty. And she found, tucked among the manuscripts, something else. A carefully wrapped bundle of letters dating from 1538 to 1540, written by a monk named Brother Aldwin. They told the story of how this library came to be hidden. Brother Aldwin had been the librarian of a monastery, which one he never named for safety, when King Henry's commissioners came to dissolve it. He had watched as they seized the land, expelled the monks, and prepared to burn the library. In secret, with the help of 2 other brothers, he had saved what he could, choosing the most precious, the most rare, the most irreplaceable works. They had smuggled them out in the night and brought them here, to this windmill, which was then owned by a sympathetic merchant who opposed the destruction of learning. They had built this chamber in secret, sealed the manuscripts inside, and then scattered, intending to return when the danger had passed. Brother Aldwin's final letter was dated 1540. He wrote that he was dying, that his fellow rescuers were already dead, and that he feared the knowledge he had saved would be lost forever. But perhaps, he wrote, in God's time, someone will find what we have preserved, and perhaps they will understand we did not do this for glory, or for the church, or even for ourselves. We did it because knowledge is sacred. It is the inheritance of all humanity, and to destroy it is a sin against the future. Beatrice sat in the candlelit chamber, surrounded by 3 centuries of preserved learning, and understood the magnitude of her responsibility. This could not be hidden forever, but it also could not be carelessly revealed. She needed help. She needed scholars she could trust. She needed a plan, and first, she needed to secure her claim to this place against her family's greed. On the 4th day, Beatrice walked back to Hartwell Hall. She found her cousins gathered in what had been her grandfather's study, now Edmund's apparently, sorting through the final effects of the estate. They looked up in surprise when she entered. "Good Lord," Lavinia said, "you're filthy. Have you actually been living in that ruin?" Beatrice was indeed covered in dust and cobwebs, her dress stained, her hair coming loose from its pins. "I have," she said calmly, "and I've come to make a proposal." Edmund leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Oh? Going to beg us to take you in?" "I'm afraid the hall is rather full at the moment." "No," Beatrice replied. "I'm going to offer to buy your properties." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then George laughed. You're mad. You haven't got 2 pennies to rub together." "Not yet," Beatrice agreed. "But I will have, and when I do, I want the option to purchase the mill, the townhouse, and the farmland at fair market value." Edmund's expression hardened. "Why would we possibly agree to that?" "Because," Beatrice said, meeting his eyes, "I'm about to make a discovery that will make the Hartwell name famous throughout England, and when I do, you're going to wish very much that you had been kinder to me." Lavinia's smile was poisonous. "A discovery? In that pile of rubble? What could you possibly discover? A family of rats?" "You'll see," Beatrice said, "soon enough. But I want your agreement, in writing, that you will not contest my ownership of the windmill or attempt to claim any discovery made on that property. Mr. Wickham can draw up the document." Edmund stood. You're wasting our time with fantasies. Get out." Beatrice didn't move. "I'll make you a wager then. If, within 6 months, I haven't made a discovery of significant value, I'll sign over the windmill to you, Edmund, for nothing. You can demolish it and do what you like with the land." That got his attention. "And if you have made this supposed discovery, then you leave me alone. You acknowledge, publicly, that grandfather was right to leave me the windmill, and you sell me the other properties if I want them." George snorted. "That's the most ridiculous." "I'll take that wager," Edmund interrupted, his eyes glinting with malice. 6 months. And when you fail, cousin, I want it in writing that you'll never darken our doors again." "Done," Beatrice said. They shook hands, and Beatrice turned to leave. "Oh, Beatrice," Lavinia called sweetly, "do try to find somewhere to bathe before you make your grand discovery. You smell like a marsh." Beatrice smiled. "I smell like hard work, Lavinia. You might try it sometime." She left them laughing and walked back to her windmill with her head high. She had 6 months. It would be enough. Beatrice's first step was to write to Mr. Wickham, asking for recommendations of trustworthy scholars with expertise in medieval manuscripts. The solicitor, intrigued, provided 3 names. The first, Professor Edmund Ashworth of Cambridge, was a renowned authority on monastic libraries. Beatrice wrote to him carefully, revealing only that she had reason to believe a small collection of medieval manuscripts might exist on her property, and asking if he would be willing to authenticate them. To her relief, he responded within a week. He would be delighted to assist, and could visit within the fortnight. In the meantime, Beatrice set about making the windmill marginally more habitable. With the small sum her grandfather had left her for immediate expenses, £20, she hired 2 men from the village to patch the worst of the roof and repair the door. She bought a simple cot, blankets, a small stove, and basic provisions. The villagers thought her quite mad, but they took her money and did the work. By the time Professor Ashworth arrived, the windmill was still austere, but at least it was dry and secure. Professor Edmund Ashworth was a man of perhaps 60, tall and spare, with wild white hair and keen grey eyes that missed nothing. He arrived in a hired carriage, accompanied by his assistant, a serious young man named Thomas Fairley. Beatrice met them at the door, her heart pounding. "Miss Hartwell," the professor said, looking at her with evident surprise. She was young, female, and living alone in a windmill, not at all what he had expected. "Professor Ashworth, thank you for coming. Please follow me." She led them to the 2nd level and the hidden trapdoor. "I must ask you to descend carefully," she said. "The rungs are secure, but it's quite dark." The professor's eyebrows rose. "Underground?" "Yes. The chamber is approximately 30 feet below ground level." She went first, carrying a lantern, and heard the professor's sharp intake of breath when he reached the bottom and saw what the light revealed. For a long moment, he simply stood, staring. Then he moved to the nearest shelf and picked up a manuscript with trembling hands. He examined it for perhaps 5 minutes, in complete silence, then set it down and picked up another. Finally, he turned to Beatrice, and she saw that his eyes were wet. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice shaking, "do you understand what this is?" "I believe it's a monastic library, hidden during the dissolution," she replied. "It is more than that," he whispered. "It is a miracle." Over the next 6 hours, Professor Ashworth and his assistant made a preliminary examination of the collection. The professor moved from shelf to shelf, occasionally exclaiming, sometimes falling silent with emotion. When they finally climbed back up to the windmill, his expression was transformed. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I have devoted my life to the study of medieval manuscripts. I have worked in the great libraries of Europe, and I can tell you without exaggeration, what you have discovered here is one of the most significant finds in the history of English scholarship." He counted off on his fingers. "I have identified at least 3 manuscripts believed completely lost. I have seen medical texts that predate anything in the British Library. I have seen astronomical observations that will rewrite our understanding of medieval science. And I have barely scratched the surface. This collection must be preserved, studied, published," he continued, his voice urgent. "It belongs to the nation, to the world." "I agree," Beatrice said calmly, "but it must be done properly, not seized by the crown or sold to private collectors. My grandfather kept it secret for 50 years because he didn't trust what would happen to it." The professor nodded slowly. "Your grandfather was a wise man." "I propose this," Beatrice said. "I will donate the collection to Cambridge University with the following conditions. First, that it remains intact and accessible to scholars freely. Second, that it be known as the Hartwell Collection, in honor of my grandfather and the unknown monks who saved it. Third, that I be named as the official guardian of the collection, with a voice in how it is studied and preserved." Professor Ashworth's face broke into a smile. "Miss Hartwell, those are the most reasonable and honorable terms I have ever heard. I accept them on behalf of the university, pending formal approval, which I guarantee you will receive." He paused. "There is one more thing. Such a discovery will need to be authenticated by other scholars, catalogued, and properly housed. That work will take years. In the meantime, the university will pay you a stipend, let us say £200 per annum, as guardian, and will provide funding to preserve this windmill as the site of the discovery. £200 a year. It was more than twice what Edmund's mill earned." Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes, but she kept her voice steady. "That is more than generous, Professor." "It is appropriate," he corrected. "You could have sold this privately for a fortune. Instead, you're ensuring it benefits scholarship. The university is getting the better end of this bargain, I assure you." News of the Hartwell collection spread through academic circles within weeks. Scholars began arriving from Cambridge, Oxford, even from the continent, seeking permission to view this extraordinary find. Beatrice, with Professor Ashworth's guidance, established strict protocols. Only 3 scholars at a time in the chamber. All materials to be handled with extreme care. All findings to be published openly. The windmill became a place of pilgrimage for the learned world, and the newspapers got hold of the story. Remarkable discovery in Suffolk marshes. Lost medieval library, found by young woman. The Hartwell collection, priceless manuscripts, hidden for 3 centuries. From worthless inheritance to national treasure, the windmill that changed history. The stories spread, each more embellished than the last. Beatrice found herself famous, a circumstance she found deeply uncomfortable, but she bore it with the same patient grace she had borne her cousin's mockery. She had work to do. 3 months after Professor Ashworth's first visit, a carriage arrived at the windmill. Beatrice was in the chamber below, cataloguing manuscripts with Thomas Fairley, when she heard shouting from above. She climbed up to find Edmund, Lavinia, and George standing in the windmill, their faces a mixture of shock and fury. "It's true then," Edmund said flatly. "The stories in the newspapers, they're all true." "Yes," Beatrice replied calmly. Lavinia's face was pinched with barely controlled rage. "You found a fortune in medieval manuscripts under this ruin, and you said nothing to your own family." "You made it quite clear I was no longer family," Beatrice replied. "And besides, I did tell you I was going to make a discovery. You laughed." George stepped forward. "Now see here, Beatrice. This is still Hartwell property. We have a right to—" "You have no rights whatsoever," Beatrice interrupted. "The windmill and all its contents were left to me, clear and outright, by grandfather's will. Mr. Wickham has confirmed this repeatedly, and I have already made arrangements to donate the collection to Cambridge University." "You had no authority to do that," Edmund shouted. "The family should have been consulted." "I am not asking for your permission or your approval," Beatrice said, her voice like steel. "I am informing you of what has already been done." Edmund's face turned an ugly shade of red. Our wager," Beatrice reminded him, "was that if I made a discovery of significant value within 6 months, you would leave me alone and acknowledge that grandfather was right. It has been 3 months. I have made that discovery. The wager is won." She pulled a document from her pocket. "This is a statement, drawn up by Mr. Wickham, acknowledging my complete ownership and control of the windmill and the Hartwell collection. I need all 3 of you to sign it." "And if we refuse," Lavinia demanded. "Then I will take you to court for harassment," Beatrice replied. "And given that I now have the financial backing of Cambridge University and the sympathy of every newspaper in England, I rather think I'll win." There was a long, tense silence. Finally, Edmund snatched the pen and signed, his movements violent. Lavinia and George followed suit, neither meeting Beatrice's eyes. "There," Edmund spat. "You've won. The orphan has beaten us all. I hope you're satisfied." "I'm not interested in winning or losing," Beatrice said quietly. "I'm interested in honoring the people who saved this knowledge at great personal risk, and my grandfather who protected it. You should be proud of what's been discovered here. It brings honor to our family name." "Honor?" Lavinia laughed bitterly. "You've made us a laughingstock, the greedy cousins who mocked the brilliant girl. That's how the papers tell it." "Then perhaps you should have been less greedy," Beatrice replied. She held the door open. "Goodbye, cousins. You're welcome to visit the windmill as members of the public once we open it for tours next year. Otherwise, I believe we have nothing more to discuss." They left in furious silence. Beatrice stood in the doorway and watched their carriage disappear down the marsh road. She felt no triumph, no vindication, only a deep, quiet relief that she would never have to seek their approval again. As autumn turned to winter, the work of cataloguing and preserving the Hartwell collection continued. The windmill became a small center of scholarly activity, with visiting academics staying at the newly built guest house, funded by the university, and spending their days in the underground chamber. Beatrice oversaw it all with a careful, methodical attention to detail that earned the respect of even the most senior professors. She also continued her own education, learning Latin and paleography from the scholars who visited, studying the manuscripts themselves with the devotion of an acolyte. One cold December afternoon, Professor Ashworth invited her to Cambridge to attend a special meeting of the University Senate. There, in the Great Hall, surrounded by centuries of academic tradition, she was formally presented with a certificate of honorary fellowship, the first woman ever to receive such recognition from the university. Miss Hartwell, the Vice-Chancellor said, has done more than discover a lost library. She has demonstrated that scholarship knows no boundary of gender, class, or circumstance. She has shown us that wisdom can be found in the most unexpected places, and that the greatest treasures are those we choose to share rather than hoard. The assembled scholars rose and applauded. Beatrice, standing in her simple dark dress among all those learned men in their academic robes, felt tears stream down her face. She thought of her younger self, alone in the servants' wing, reading by candlelight. She thought of her grandfather, watching her quietly, trusting her with his greatest secret. She thought of Brother Aldwin and his companions, risking everything to save knowledge they would never see recovered. And she understood. She had not won anything. She had been given a gift, the gift of being part of something larger than herself, something that connected past to future, knowledge to wisdom, solitude to community. It was the greatest inheritance anyone could receive. The following spring, Beatrice stood in the Windmill's ground floor, which had been converted into a small museum and reading room. The underground chamber had been fitted with proper lighting and climate control, preserving the manuscripts for generations to come. Today was the official opening of the Hartwell collection to the public. Scholars, dignitaries, and curious locals filled the space, examining the carefully curated displays that told the story of Brother Aldwin, of Thomas Hartwell, and of the discovery itself. Among the crowd, Beatrice noticed a young woman, perhaps 17, standing before one of the display cases with an expression of intense concentration. She was poorly dressed, clearly not from a family of means, but her eyes shone with fierce intelligence. Beatrice approached her. "Are you interested in medieval history?" The girl startled, then blushed. "Yes, miss. I know I shouldn't be here. I'm just a dressmaker's daughter, but I read about this place in the newspaper, and I saved up for the coach fare, and—" "You have every right to be here," Beatrice interrupted gently. "That's the whole point. This knowledge belongs to everyone, not just the wealthy or the educated." The girl looked at her with something like wonder. Are you Miss Hartwell?" "I am." "I think what you did," the girl's voice caught. "I think it's the most wonderful thing I've ever heard. You proved that we don't have to be what people expect, that we can be more." Beatrice felt her throat tighten. "What's your name?" "Alice, miss. Alice Warren." "Well, Alice, how would you like to work here?" "I need an assistant to help catalogue the collection, and I'd much rather train someone with genuine curiosity than hire someone with fancy credentials and no passion." Alice's eyes went wide. "You mean, you'd pay me to work with books?" "I mean exactly that. The position includes room and board in the guest house and time for continuing your education. Professor Ashworth has agreed to provide instruction in Latin and paleography to any of my assistants who want it." The girl looked as if she might faint. Yes, please, thank you." Beatrice smiled. "Don't thank me yet. It's hard work, but if you have the dedication, I promise you'll learn more here than you ever imagined." As Alice hurried off to tell her mother, Professor Ashworth appeared at Beatrice's elbow. "Training the next generation already?" he asked with a smile. "Someone gave me a chance," Beatrice replied. "It seems only right to pass it on." They stood together, watching the crowd move through the space, marveling at the manuscripts, reading the story of how they had been saved, You know, the professor said thoughtfully, when your grandfather kept this secret, he was protecting it from a world that wasn't ready to appreciate it properly. He was waiting for the right person, the right moment. Do you think this is that moment? Beatrice asked. I think you made it that moment, he replied. You could have claimed this discovery as your own triumph, used it for personal gain. Instead, you turned it into something that belongs to everyone. That takes a wisdom your cousins will never possess. Beatrice thought of Edmund, Lavinia, and George, each profiting from their practical inheritances while remaining small in spirit. She thought of herself, given what appeared worthless, and finding in it a wealth beyond measure. My grandfather wrote that what the world dismisses as worthless often holds the greatest treasures, she said. I used to think he meant the manuscripts. And now? Professor Ashworth asked. Beatrice looked around at the scholars poring over the books, the villagers from Ravensmere pointing proudly at the displays, young Alice already opening a catalogue with reverent hands. Now I think he meant the opportunity to serve something greater than yourself, she said. That's the real treasure. Everything else is just paper and ink. 10 years later, the Windmill had become a landmark of international significance. The Hartwell collection had been fully catalogued, a process that revealed even more treasures than initially suspected, including a previously unknown, illuminated gospel and a complete herbal that revolutionized understanding of medieval medicine. Beatrice, now 29, was a respected scholar in her own right, having published several papers on monastic libraries and medieval preservation practices. She had also established a school at the Windmill, open to both boys and girls from any background, that combined practical education with classical scholarship. Alice Warren was now her senior assistant, fluent in Latin and halfway through her own research on the astronomical manuscripts. The guest house had expanded to accommodate the constant stream of visiting scholars, and the marshland around the Windmill, once considered worthless, had been purchased by the university and preserved as a nature sanctuary, its wild beauty protected for future generations. On a bright May morning, Beatrice stood at the top of the Windmill, now fully restored, its sails turning gently in the sea breeze, and looked out over the marshes. In the distance, she could see the spire of Ravensmere Church. She thought of the girl she had been 10 years ago, standing in the drawing room while her cousins laughed. She had been afraid then, though she hadn't shown it. Afraid of being worthless, of having nothing, of being forgotten. Now she understood. Worth was not something given to you by others. It was something you created through your choices, your work, your dedication to something beyond yourself. Her grandfather had known that. He had looked at his grandchildren and seen not their inheritances, but their characters, and he had given each of them exactly what they deserved. Edmund still ran his mill, prosperous but never satisfied. Lavinia had moved to London, wealthy but perpetually complaining. George had sold his farmland at the first good offer and lived now in idle comfort. They had taken what was given and changed nothing. Beatrice had taken what appeared worthless and transformed it into something that would endure for centuries. Not because of the manuscripts, precious as they were, but because she had understood that the greatest inheritance was not wealth or property. It was the responsibility to be worthy of the trust placed in you, to honor those who came before, and to serve those who would come after. That was what her grandfather had really left her, and that was what she would spend her life honoring. Below in the museum, a school group had just arrived, children from the village, their eyes wide with wonder. Their teacher, a young man whose own education had been sponsored by the Hartwell Scholarship Fund, was explaining the story of Brother Aldwin and the hidden library. "So remember," he said to the attentive children, "what looks worthless to some people might be priceless to others. It all depends on whether you look with the eyes of greed or the eyes of wisdom." A small girl raised her hand. "What's the difference, sir?" The teacher smiled. "Greed asks, 'What can this do for me?' Wisdom asks, 'What can this do for me?' Miss Hartwell chose wisdom. That's why we're all standing here today." Beatrice, listening from the stairway, smiled and turned back to her work. There were still thousands of manuscripts to study, students to teach, visitors to welcome. The work would never be finished. But then, the best work never was. It simply passed from one set of hands to the next, each generation adding its own contribution, building something that no single person could create alone. Her grandfather had started this chain. Brother Aldwin had started it long before that, and Beatrice would pass it on to Alice, and to the students in her school, and to whoever came after. That was the real secret hidden below the windmill. Not manuscripts, however precious, but the understanding that knowledge, like love, grows greater when it is shared, and that the greatest treasures are those we are willing to give away. Thank you for staying with us through this journey from mockery to vindication, from isolation to community, from a forgotten windmill to a beacon of learning. Beatrice's story reminds us that true worth is not found in what others think of us, but in what we choose to do with what we've been given. If this story moved you, please leave a like and tell us in the comments what you believe is the greatest inheritance anyone can receive. And be sure to subscribe for more stories of hidden treasures and the quiet courage it takes to honor them. We'll see you next time.